Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. The Old Charges of Freemasonry by Brother H L Haywood. Section 1. What the Old Charges are. I have just come from reading an article in one of the more obscure Masonic periodicals, in which an unknown brother lets go with this very familiar remark. As for me, I am not interested in the musty old documents of the past. I want to know what's going on today. The context makes it clear that he had in mind the old charges. A sufficient reply to this ignoramus is that the old charges are among the things that are going on today. Eliminate them from Freemasonry as it now functions, and not a subordinate lodge, or a grand lodge, or any other regular Masonic body could operate at all. They are what the Constitution is to the United States government, and what its statutes are to every state in the Union. All the constitutions, statutes, laws, rules, bylaws, and regulations, to some extent or other, hark back to the old charges, and without them, Masonic jurisprudence, or the methods for governing and regulating the legal affairs of the craft, would be left hanging suspended in the air. In proportion as Masonic leaders, Grand Masters, Worshipful Masters, and jurisprudence committees ignore, or forget, or misunderstand these Masonic charters, they run amok and lead the craft into all manner of wild and un-Masonic undertakings. If some magician could devise a method whereby a clear conception of the old charges and what they stand for could be installed onto the head of every active Mason in the land, it would save us all from embarrassment times without number, and it would relieve Grand Lodges and other grand bodies from the needless expenditure of hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. If there is any practical necessity, any hard, down, next-to-the-ground necessity anywhere in Freemasonry today, it is for a general, clear-headed understanding of the ancient constitutions and landmarks of the order. By the old charges is meant those ancient documents that have come down to us from the 14th century and afterwards, in which are incorporated the traditional history, the legends, and the rules, and the regulations of Freemasonry. They are called variously ancient manuscripts, ancient constitutions, legends of the craft, Gothic manuscripts, old records, etc., etc. In their physical makeup, these documents are sometimes found in the form of handwritten paper or parchment rolls, the units of which are either sewed or pasted together, of handwritten sheets, stitched together in book form, and in the familiar printed form of a modern book. Sometimes they are found incorporated in the minute book of a lodge. They range in estimated date from 1390 until the first quarter of the 18th century, and a few of them are specimens of beautiful Gothic script. The largest number of them are in the keeping of the British Museum. The Masonic Library of West Yorkshire, England, has in custody the second largest number. As already said, these old charges, for such is their most familiar appellation, form the basis of modern Masonic constitutions and therefore jurisprudence. They establish the continuity of the Masonic institution through a period of more than 5 centuries, and by fair implication much longer, and at the same time, and by token of the same significance, prove the great antiquity of Masonry by written documents, which is a thing no other craft in existence is able to do. These manuscripts are traditional and legendary in form, and are therefore not to be read as histories are. Nevertheless, a careful and critical study of them based on internal evidence sheds more light on the earliest times of Freemasonry than any other one source whatever. It is believed that the old charges were used in making a Mason in the old operative days, that they served as constitutions of lodges in many cases, and sometimes functioned as what we today call a warrant. The systematic study of these manuscripts began in the middle of the 19th century, at which time only a few were known to be in existence. In 1872, William James Hewan listed 32. Owing largely to his efforts, many others were discovered, so that in 1889 Gould was able to list 62, and Hewan himself in 1895 tabulated 66 manuscript copies, 9 printed versions, and 11 missing versions. This number has been so much increased of late years that in the AQC volume 31, page 40 of 1918, Brother Roderick H. Baxter, now Worshipful Master of Quato Coronati Lodge, listed 98, which number included the versions known to be missing. Brother Baxter's list is particularly valuable in that he gives data as to when and where these manuscripts have been reproduced. For the sake of being better able to compare one copy with another, Dr. W. Begeman classified all the versions into 4 general families: the Grand Lodge family, the Sloane family, the Roberts family, and the Spencer family. These family groups he divided further into branches, and he believed that the Spencer family was an offshoot of the Grand Lodge family and the Roberts family an offshoot of the Sloane family. In this general manner of grouping, the erudite doctor was followed by Hewan, Gould, and their colleagues, and his classification still holds in general. Attempts have been made in recent years to upset it, but without much success. The old charges are peculiarly English. No such documents have ever been found in Ireland. Scotch documents are known to be of English origin. It was once held by Findel and other German writers that the English versions ultimately derived from German sources, but this has been disproved. The only known point of similarity between the old charges and such German documents as the Torgau Ordinances and the Cologne Constitutions is the legend of the 4 crowned martyrs, and this legend is found among English versions only in the Regius Manuscript. As Gould well says, the British manuscripts have neither predecessors nor rivals. They are the richest and rarest things in the whole field of Masonic writings. When the old charges are placed side by side, it is immediately seen that in their account of the traditional history of the craft they vary in a great many particulars. Nevertheless, they appear to have derived from some common origin, and, in the main, they tell the same tale, which is as interesting as a fairy story out of Grimm. Did the original of this traditional account come from some individual, or was it born out of a floating tradition, like the folk tales of ancient people? Authorities differ much on this point. Begeman not only declared that the first version of the story originated with an individual, but even set out what he deemed to be the literary sources used by that great unknown. The doctor's arguments are powerful. On the other hand, others contend that the story began as a general, vague oral tradition, and that this was in the course of time reduced to writing. In either event, why was the story ever written? In all probability, an answer to that question will never be forthcoming. But W. Harry Rylands and others have been of the opinion that the first written versions were made in response to a general writ for return issued in 1388. Rylands' words may be quoted. "It appeared to me not at all impossible that much, if not all, of the legendary history was composed in answer to the writ for returns issued to the guilds all over the country in the 12th year of Richard II, AD 1388. Section 2. The 2 oldest manuscripts. In 1757, King George II presented to the British Museum a collection of some 12,000 volumes, the nucleus of which had been laid by King Henry VII, and which came to be known as the Royal Library. Among these books was a rarely beautiful manuscript written by hand on 64 pages of vellum, about 4 by 5 inches in size, which a cataloguer, David Castley, entered as number 17A1 under the title a poem of moral duties, here entitled Constitutionis Artis Geometri Secundum. It was not until Mr. J. O. Halliwell, afterwards Halliwell Phillips, a non-Mason, chanced to make the discovery that the manuscript was known to be a Masonic document. Mr. Phillips read a paper on the manuscript before the Society of Antiquaries in 1839, and in the following year published a volume entitled Early History of Freemasonry in England, in which he incorporated a transcript of the document, along with a few pages in facsimile. This important work will be found incorporated in the familiar Universal Masonic Library, the rusty sheepskin bindings of which strike the eye on almost every Masonic bookshelf. This manuscript was known as the Halliwell, or as the Halliwell Phillips, until some 50 years afterwards Gould rechristened it in honour of the Royal Library in which it is found, the Regius, and this since then has become the more familiar cognomen. David Casely, a learned specialist in old manuscripts, dated the Regius as of the 14th century. E. A. Bond, another expert, dated it as of the middle of the 15th century. Dr. Kloss, the German specialist, placed it between 1427 and 1445. But the majority have agreed on 1390 as the most probable date. It is impossible to arrive at absolute certainty on this point, says Hewan, whose old charges should be consulted, save that it is not likely to be older than 1390, but maybe some 20 or so years later. Dr. W. Begerman made a study of the document that has never been equalled for thoroughness, and arrived at a conclusion that may be given in his own words. It was written towards the end of the 14th, or at least quite at the beginning of the 15th century, not in Gloucester itself as being too southerly, but in the north of Gloucester, or in the neighbouring north of Herefordshire, or even possibly in the south of Worcestershire. The Regius Manuscript is the only one of all the versions to be written in metre, and it may have been composed by a priest, if one may judge by certain internal evidences, although the point is disputed. There are some 800 lines in the poem, the strictly Masonic portion coming to an end at line 576, after which begins what Hewan called a sermonette on moral duties, in which there is quite a Roman Catholic vein, with references to the Sins Seven, the Sweet Lady, referring to the Virgin, and to holy water. There is no such specific Mariolatry in any other version of the Old Charges, though the great majority of them express loyalty to the Holy Church, and all of them, until Anderson's familiar version, are specifically Christian so far as religion is concerned. The author furnishes a list of 15 points and 15 articles, all of which are quite specific instructions concerning the behaviour of a craftsman. This portion is believed by many to have been the charges to an initiate as used in the author's period, and is therefore deemed the most important feature of the book, as furnishing us a picture of the regulations of the craft at that remote date. The craft is described as having come into existence as an organised fraternity in King Adelstune's day, but in this the author contradicts himself because he refers to things written in the old books, and takes it for granted a certain antiquity for the masonry which, as in all the old charges, is made synonymous with geometry, a thing very different in those days from the abstract science over which we laboured during our school days. The Regius poem is evidently a book about masonry, rather than a document of masonry, and may very well have been written by a non-Mason, although there is no way in which we can verify such theories, especially seeing that we now know nothing about the document, save what it has to tell us about itself, which is little. In his commentary on the Regius, R. F. Gould produced a paragraph that has ever since served as the pivot of a great debate. It reads as follows, and refers to the sermonette portion which deals with moral duties. These rules of decorum read very curiously in the present age, but their inapplicability to the circumstances of the working masons of the 14th or 15th centuries will at once be apparent. They were intended for the gentlemen of those days, and the instruction for behaviour in the presence of a lord, at table, and in the society of ladies, would have all been equally out of place in a code of manners drawn up for the use of a guild or craft of artisans. The point of this is that there must have been present among the craftsmen of that time a number of men not engaged at all in labour, and therefore were, as we would now describe them, speculatives. This would be of immense importance if Gould had made good his point, but he was not able to do so. The greatest minds of the period in question were devoted to architecture, and there is no reason not to believe that among the craftsmen were members of good families. Also, the craft was in contact with the clergy all the while, and therefore many of its members may well have stood in need of rules for preserving proper decorum in great houses and among the members of the upper classes. From Woodford until the present time, the great majority of Masonic scholars have believed the old charges to have been used by a strictly operative craft, and it is evident that they will continue to do so until more conclusive evidence to the contrary is forthcoming than Gould's surmise. Next to the Regius, the oldest manuscript is that known as the Cooke. It was published by R. Spencer in London in 1861 and was edited by Mr. Matthew Cooke, hence the name. In the British Museum's catalogue, it is listed as Additional Manuscript 23,198 and has been dated by Hewen at 1450 or thereabouts, an estimate which most of the specialists have concurred. Dr. Beggerman believed the document to have been compiled and written in the southeast portion of the Western Midlands, say in Gloucestershire or Oxfordshire, possibly also in southeast Worcestershire or southwest Warwickshire. The Book of Charges, which forms the second part of the document, is certainly of the 14th century, the historical or first part of quite the beginning of the 15th. The Cooke Manuscript was most certainly in the hands of Mr. George Payne when, in his second term as Grand Master in 1720, he compiled the General Regulations, and which Anderson included in his own version of the Constitutions, published in 1723. Anderson himself evidently made use of lines 901 to 960 of the manuscript. The Cooke was reprinted in facsimile in 1890, and included therewith a commentary by George William Speth, which is, in my own amateur opinion, an even more brilliant piece of work than Gould's commentary on the Regius. Some of Speth's conclusions are of permanent value, and I paraphrase his findings in my own words. The manuscript is a transcript of a yet older document, and was written by a Mason. There were several versions of the charges to a Mason in circulation at the time. The manuscript is in two parts, the former of which is an attempt at a history of the craft, the latter of which is a version of the charges. Of this portion, Speth writes that it is far and away the earliest, best, and purest version of the old charges which we possess. The manuscript mentions 9 articles, and these, evidently, were legal enforcements at the time. The 9 points given were probably not legally binding, but were morally so. Congregations of Masons were held here and there, but no General Assembly or Grand Lodge. Grand Masters existed in fact, but not in name, and presided at one meeting of a congregation only. Many of our present usages may be traced in their original form to this manuscript. Section 3. Anderson's Constitutions and other printed versions. One of the most important of all the versions of the old charges is not an ancient original at all, but a printed edition issued in 1722 and known as the Roberts, though it is believed to be a copy of an ancient document. Of this, W. J. Hewen writes, "The only copy known was purchased by me at Brother Spencer's sale for Masonic works, etc., in 1875, for £8 10s, on behalf of the late Brother R. F. Bauer, and is now in the magnificent library of the Grand Lodge of Iowa, USA." This tiny volume is easily the most priceless Masonic literary possession in America, and was published in exact facsimile by the National Masonic Research Society, with an eloquent introduction by Dr. Joseph Fort Newton in 1916. The Reverend Edmund Cox edited a famous reprint in 1871. It is a version meriting the most careful study on the part of the Masonic student, because it had a decided influence on the literature and jurisprudence of the craft after its initial appearance. It appeared in one of the most interesting and momentous periods of modern speculative Masonry, namely, in the years between the organization of the First Grand Lodge in 1717 and the appearance of Anderson's Constitution in 1723. It is the earliest printed version of the Old Charges known to exist. Another well-known printed version is that published in 1724 and known as the Briscoe. This was the second publication of its kind. The third printed version was issued between 1728 and 1729 by Benjamin Cole, and known as the Cole edition in consequence. This version is considered a literary gem in that the main body of the text is engraved throughout in most beautiful style. A special edition of this book was made in Leeds in 1897, the value of which was enhanced by one of W. J. Hewan's famous introductions. For our own modern and practical purposes, the most important of all the versions ever made was that compiled by Dr. James Anderson in 1723 and everywhere known familiarly as Anderson's Constitution. A second edition appeared, much changed and enlarged, in 1738, a third by John Entick in 1756, and so on every few years until by 1888 22 editions in all had been issued. Anderson's title page is interesting to read. The Constitution, History, Laws, Charges, Orders, Regulations, and Usages of the Right Worshipful Fraternity of Accepted Freemasons, collected from their general records and their faithful traditions of many ages, to be read at the admission of a new brother, when the Master or Warden shall begin, or order some other brother to read as follows, etc. After the word follows, Anderson's own version of Masonic history begins with this astonishing statement. Adam, our first parent, created after the image of God, the great architect of the universe, must have had the liberal sciences, particularly geometry, written on his heart. Thus did Mr. Anderson launch his now thrice familiar account of the history of Freemasonry, an account which, save in the hands of the most expert Masonic antiquarian, yields very little dependable historical fact whatsoever, but which, owing to the prestige of its author, came to be accepted for generations as a bona fide history of the craft. It will be many a long year yet before the rank and file of brethren shall have learned that Dr. Anderson's history belongs in the realm of fable for the most part, and has never been accepted as anything else by knowing ones. The established facts concerning Dr. Anderson's own private history comprise a record almost as brief as the short and simple annals of the poor. Brother J.T. Thorpe, one of the most distinguished of veterans among living exile Masonic scholars, has given it an excellent brief form. Of this distinguished brother we know very little. He is believed to have been born, educated, and made a Mason in Scotland, subsequently settling in London as a Presbyterian minister. He is mentioned for the first time in the Proceedings of the Grand Lodge of England on September the 29th, 1721, when he was appointed to revise the old Gothic constitutions. This revision was approved by the Grand Lodge of England on September the 29th in 1723, in which year Anderson was Junior Grand Warden under the Duke of Wharton. He published a second edition of the Book of Constitutions in 1738 and died in 1739. This is all that is known of him. In his 1738 edition, Anderson so garbled up his account of the founding of Grand Lodge, and contradicted his own earlier story in such fashion, that R.F. Gould was inclined to believe either that he had become disgruntled and full of spleen, or else that he was in his dotage. Be that as it may, Anderson's historical pages are to be read with extreme caution. His constitution itself, or that part dealing with the principles and regulations of the craft, is most certainly a compilation made of extracts of other versions of the old charges, pretty much mixed with the doctor's own ideas in the premises, and so much at variance with previous customs that the official adoption thereof caused much dissension among the lodges, and may have had something to do with the disaffection which at last led to the formation of the ancient Grand Lodge of 1751 or thereabouts. The Anderson of this latter body, which in time waxed very powerful, was Lawrence Dermot, a brilliant Irishman who as Grand Secretary was leader of the ancient forces for many years, and who wrote for the body its own constitution called a Hymen Raison, which cryptic title is believed by some to mean Worthy Brother Secretary. The first edition of this important version was made in 1756, a second in 1764, and so on until by the 1813 an eighth had been published. A very complete collection of all editions is in the Masonic Library at Philadelphia. A few Grand Lodges, Pennsylvania among them, continue to call their Book of Constitutions the Hymen Raison. Anderson himself is still on the rack of criticism. Learned brethren are checking his statements, shifting his pages, and leaving no stone unturned in order to appraise correctly his contributions to Masonic history. But there is not so much disagreement on the Constitution. In that document, which did not give satisfaction to many upon its appearance, Anderson, as Brother Lionel Vibert has well said, builded better than he knew, because he produced a document which until now serves as the groundwork of nearly all Grand Lodge constitutions having jurisdiction over symbolic masonry, and which, once and for all, established speculative Freemasonry on a basis apart and with no sectarian character either as to religion or politics. For all his faults as an historian, and these faults were as much of his age as of his own shortcomings, Anderson is a great figure in our annals and deserves, at the hand of every student, a careful and reverent study. For more Masonic podcasts, videos, music, texts, and artwork, visit fromthequarries.com or subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook accounts by searching From the Quarries.